Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timss, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. I was thrilled to find that I'd been invited down to spend a week or two at Radcliffe, the family home of another set of English cousins, the Pridays. Grace Priday was Henry's sister and related to me by marriage in exactly the same way as Henry was. She was Dad's second cousin, and her children and I shared old W.G. Brown as a great-grandfather. Being a member of what had started as a tiny, mainly British colony in Durban, we South Africans from Natal called practically anybody who was related to us in some way cousins, unlike the English, who only count first cousins as such. We traditionally called even members of third generations away cousins. I suppose the idea of relations, however far removed, was just too precious to us in that vast, wild subcontinent. It was a bit of a scramble for me to repack my clothes, since I was to be collected by another cousin the next morning to catch a train to Buckingham. I either didn't find time or forgot to ring Gary to tell him what my next plans were. He was, to my knowledge, going to wait for me to be more settled in England before we got together again. I couldn't be trusted to travel on my own, so Blair Priday, who was 4 years younger than I was, but in worldly ways a lot older, had been sent up to accompany me to Buckinghamshire, and she and I hopped on board a train from some enormous London station, where Henry had dropped us, and together we travelled out past endless suburbs, where I saw little gardens all packed together behind rows and rows of neat, identical little houses, all joined together in lines. I peered through the grimy glass, fascinated by the sheer multitude of human life which must be living there, as the houses went on for miles and what seemed like forever. Gradually the houses thinned out and small fields and hedgerows began to appear. Blair was a seasoned traveller, and I was so glad of her company as we rumbled along past many stations. I would never have known where to get off, as the announcements over the tannoy on the train itself were unintelligible. The announcer called out name after name, and after about an hour, Blair suddenly jumped to her feet and said, "Buckingham coming up. We have to get off here." I followed her, carrying my big case, still fairly full, but having left half my stuff at the Barnby's flat. I wasn't a good packer, since Evelina, my nanny, had always packed my school trunks with uniforms, and Mum had supervised everything. Ever since I'd left for Switzerland, I'd just taken everything I accumulated with me, until the lid of my case, one of Mum's old cast-offs, bulged, and I had to sit on it to get the catches to snap shut. Blair's mother, my Aunt Grace, had come to pick us up from the station there, and we bumped off in her station wagon down pretty narrow lanes, lined with high hedgerows, past bigger and more neatly cultivated green fields that I'd ever seen. These pastures and meadows seemed almost manicured to me after my 18 years living in the remotest bush and veldt. Even the sheep appeared to have been freshly laundered, and were a strange-looking animal compared to our merinos. They had long black faces, floppy ears, and strange, untidy, raggedy-looking wool, far less woolly than the coats of the sheep I'd grown up with. Cattle were plentiful too, and I saw many breeds strange to me, being used to our hardy Aberdeen Angus crossed with Brahman and some Simmenthaler blood bred into them. To my joy, I saw lots of beautifully groomed, gleaming, thoroughbred horses too, standing around under mainly oak trees in the shade, the leaves of which they'd nibbled to a level as high as they could reach, and which left the impressions that the trees had been carefully pruned to a precise umbrella-like shape. I enjoyed all this tame and park-like countryside. It all looked so well ordered, and there were no weeds to be seen. The hedges themselves were colourful with red and yellow berries, and some still in flower. There were flat pink roses in profusion growing everywhere, which Grace said were dog roses when I asked her. I knew Grace from her regular visits to our farm, New Forest, as I was growing up. Like Henry, her brother, she enjoyed coming out to her country of birth to drink in the heat and dust of her birthplace. We drew into the driveway at Rudcliffe Grange, their rambling 16th century home, which still retained many of its original features and was filled with history. The main feature was their elegant Elizabethan panelled room and the Georgian sitting room with its vast fireplace. The house was big and sprawling and surrounded by acres of meadows and country lanes. There was even a crystal clear rippling stream that ran between the fields, which had ancient weeping willows planted along its banks, and whose longest leafy tendrils trailed in the brook. It was enchanting, and the house, with its moss and lichen-covered roof tiles, many ornate chimneys, and warm red brick walls, all added to its immense charm. The house seemed to go on forever, and had a long wing, and then another built onto that, which accommodated the large Pryday family. Grace had been married at quite a young age to Dallas Brett, who'd been killed early on in the Second World War, and has had a son, Hugh, who was 9 years older than I was. In fact, Hugh had spent last Christmas with us on the farm in South Africa, and I sat next to him at the big dining room table at home the day before I left with Dad to go overseas to finishing school. After the war, Grace had remarried to Clive Priday, a doctor who now practiced at Stowe, the famous private, or public as it's so oddly described in English terms, school for boys. Grace's warm hospitality swept me up into the big family fold, and I was given a lovely airy bedroom somewhere upstairs in the far wing of their vast house. Hugh no longer lived at home and had just left Oxford to do something in the city and lived in a flat there. But Matthew, Helen, Blair, Liz and Tom still all lived at home. Matthew having just left Winchester College, another public school in Hampshire, as he was 18, the same age as I was. There was Helen, 16, Blair, 14, Liz, 12, and finally Tom, aged 10. With 6 children in all and 5 still at home, Grace and Clive had their hands full, and my aunt managed somehow to produce vast meals 3 times a day for 9 of us. My first cousin Annabel had been invited to join us all at Radcliffe. She was Dad's younger and only sister, Josephine's daughter. We knew each other well, as we'd spent the previous 5 years together in the same form at St. Anne's College, in the same house too, and had shared a cubicle in the dorm many times. The vast difference between us was that Annabel had been made a prefect and vice head of McCrory House in our 6th form there, and I'd been the rebel, one of the 5 girls, all of whom were my closest friends, who were not given any type of office. We were far too irresponsible and insubordinate to be trusted to carry out any duties that would set a good example to the younger girls, rather the reverse. Annabel had just arrived in London, as I recall, and was about to begin a year doing some kind of tertiary education. We were still enjoying beautiful sunny weather every day, and my cousin seized the opportunity to take me over to Stowe School, where, as it was still the boys' summer holidays, they appeared to have free rein over the entire place. And what a place! I gaped as Clive drove us the couple of miles there. It was well within easy walking distance, but the girls pleaded to be driven over there as it was too hot to walk all the way, and good-natured, kind Clive took us there, crammed into the station wagon. Those of us who could ride commandeered the Stowe riding school's horses, and we had them saddled up by the resident grooms and galloped these wonderfully obedient and well-turned-out thoroughbreds all over the entire estate. Originally owned by the Temple family under Elizabeth I, Sir Thomas Temple, as first Baronet of Stowe in 1611, having bought his title from James I, were originally sheep farmers and had made their name by marrying heiresses and following their political ambitions to become 19th century Dukes of Buckingham. The history of the Stowe estate is a long one, and its magnificence is still visible today, despite the decline of the family fortune, and was saved by the creation of the Stowe School in 1923. The place, now owned by the National Trust, is enormous, and the grounds were almost entirely laid out by Capability Brown in the 1740s, creating the landscapes that were visited by tourists in the 18th century and what we still see today. It's like many of those vast and incredibly beautiful stately homes now open to the public all over England and even around here where I live. Under the guidance of mainly Blair, who was the best rider and about as much of a tomboy as I was, we took full advantage of the whole place. We cantered sedately on horseback down the long straight driveway called the Grand Avenue, 1.5 miles long, to the imposing Corinthian arch entranceway. Apparently, the only person known to have passed through it en route to the house was Queen Victoria, for whom it was especially opened. But we trotted our mounts regally through the magnificent archway and continued for a gallop over the grassy, closely mown lawns to return via the Oxford Bridge, which crosses a serpentine lake transformed from an old mill pond. We also swam in that same lake, having brought our swimming costumes with us. There were enormous pike with terrifying sounding teeth in that lake, and we swam with trepidation that we could be savaged at any time, since we couldn't see too clearly through those rather murky waters. We also explored the spectacular views, magical lakes, hidden corners, and over 40 temples and monuments, including the spectacular statue of George I, dressed as Marcus Aurelius, which stands on the north front of the house. It was George I who made Sir Richard Temple a Viscount in 1718. The ha-ha at Stowe, built by Charles Bridgeman as a symbol of grandeur, was probably the longest ever bridge. A ha-ha, the French ha-ha or saut de loup, is a recessed landscape design element that creates a vertical area, particularly on one side, while preserving an uninterrupted view of the landscape beyond from the other side, a bit like an infinity pool, which gives the illusion that the water in the pool is part of the sea. Day after day we took advantage of it all and treated the place as if it was our own. Each day, very late in the afternoon, Grace or Clive would drive over to fetch us, and we tumbled, exhausted and often filthy, into the back of the vehicle, to be driven home to Radcliffe Grange, where Grace conjured up delicious suppers for our well-sharpened appetites. The only rule my aunt insisted on was that the young do all the washing up, and dutifully, Annabel and I presented ourselves in the kitchen after our evening meal, the first night of our stay there, to find nobody else but Grace, who showed us how to wash up. Neither of us had a clue, both being South Africans, and went off to her and Clive's sitting room for a well-earned rest and a snifter of brandy. Where were all the others? The rest of the group, our cousins, with whom we'd spent the entire day? Nowhere to be seen, so we both gamely tackled the towering pile of glasses, crockery, and finally pans, probably doing a rotten job, but at least attempting it. After we'd finally completed the mammoth task of cleaning up after so many people, we searched around the many rooms that the rabbit warren-like house presented, and eventually found all our cousins sitting in front of a big black and white television set watching Top of the Pops, a wonderfully new and contemporary program that showcased all the up-and-coming pop stars and bands we'd barely, if ever, heard of back in South Africa, which didn't even have television in any form. We were slightly miffed, as we'd have loved to have watched the show too, and it only came on once a week. And also to have been so cleverly outwitted by our far more sussed cousins. That's enough for today. I'll continue next week with more of the adventures with our cousins, my cousins, and I'll see you then. It's goodbye from me. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.